But we went to this robotics company, Unitree, and we were filming, and the engineers told us to stop filming because they are now concerned that the Germans will steal their intellectual property.
Later.
最近有个新闻特别有意思，德国媒体在拍摄咱们中国的语速机器人时，被中方工程师紧急叫停了。事后，德媒酸溜溜的在网上抱怨，说中国人这是在防备德国人偷技术。很多人听到这可能觉得有点反直觉。曾经以精密机械制造傲视全球，大搞工业 4.0 的德国，现在居然会被咱们防着偷技术。但如果你仔细看了近期德国媒体内部的一场深度政经对话，你就会明白，中方工程师的防备不仅合理，而且恰恰戳中了德国人当下最敏感脆弱的神经。来看影片。
Germany is struggling with some agonizing dilemmas about its relationship with China right now. It's trying to get its head around two seemingly conflicting ideas. That China made modern Germany rich on the one hand, and that it might bring about Germany's downfall on the other. Well, if that sounds overdramatic, stay with us because we're going to dig deep into these dilemmas today on Berlin Briefing, and most importantly, what Germany is going to do about them. I mean, you've been, like I just mentioned in the intro, yeah? You've been writing about this idea of a China shock about to hit Germany, or in the process of hitting Germany, a bit like there was an earlier China shock that hit the United States. So this feeds into what Michele was just explaining there. Like, explain what for you is the China shock that is facing Germany.
It's twofold, right? One is our China trap in terms of dependencies of supply chains, critical minerals plus other industrial supply chains where if that, but the even more severe for the longer term prosperity of Germany is that China, I think for legitimate reasons, has achieved moving up the value chain and is competing with all the core industries that made Germany rich: chemicals, automotive, machine tools. And China is a leader now in all these industries. So you're pumping all these goods to the European market and to third markets where German companies get obliterated in competition. So that's the China shock. Our core industries are facing mortal threats, and also future industries, I mean robotics and biotechnology and so on. And we need to find an answer as Germany and as Europe in order to how to deal with this competition.
Yeah, so we have this China shock, which is a combination of China becoming a huge competitor instead of a place to make money for Germany, and also China's control over these supply chains, and then this issue of supporting Russia. Yeah, so you basically got these kind of like sort of three sets of things.
The Chinese consumers no longer think that made in Germany is that terribly sexy. They've created their own brands. There's the trade imbalance, and then there's a small scene which really shows how the tables have turned. I was in China also with Olaf Scholz and Angela Merkel before, and there the constant complaint was that there was intellectual property rights that really was a huge concern. It continues to be a concern, but we went to this robotics company, Unitree, which creates these partially AI steered but still manually steered robots who can dance, who have movements that no other company is able to create such smooth movements at the moment. And we were filming, and the engineers told us to stop filming because they are now concerned that the Germans will steal their intellectual property and their technological edge. So the formula of the past, and he did recognize this, is that the technological edge is no longer made in Germany and made in Europe, and the Chinese simply produce. The technological edge, particularly on AI, has shifted. Yes, it's partly in the Silicon Valley, which is getting a bit arrogant, but it's really taking off in China. And that's the market of the future. And that is something where even the chancellor of the third largest economy speaking to the president of the second largest economy is on the defensive here because they're struggling here on their own market. And at the same time, he recognizes and tells companies that if they continue to invest large scale, they will end up being on their own if anything goes wrong.
Read the joint communique. Germany and China agreed on a joint statement, by the way, in which Mr. Merz agreed to the language, not talking about a Ukraine war, but the Ukraine problem. which is quite remarkable. But let's get back what the statement says. Germany issued these, it lists Germany's grudges, and then it lists China's grudges, because they say we complain about overcapacity and so on, and currency stuff, and they say, oh, you're securitizing the relationship, you do export controls, you do technology controls, you don't allow Huawei to run your critical infrastructure and so on. It's just a side-by-side acknowledgement. We have these complaints, they have these complaints, and I think zero progress.
I think it's noteworthy that he, as a leader of the opposition, saw himself as a critic in chief of the Scholz government to get tougher on China, and that he now found himself in a position. We saw that soundbite from the CDU, but he went there and clearly pulled out his diplomacy and was a lot more soft-spoken. It's not the first time that we've seen Merz try to please the audience where he is. Also, just a more general point about how he communicates and how he tunes into situations that he goes into. He manages to marry his charm offensive to China out of pure necessity, which we can see in the economic figures, with German exports to China plummeting despite the fact that there still is solid growth in China. At the moment, China could single-handedly stop the rearmament of Europe by withdrawing their support, their exports of rare earths, and that's a huge problem. And it also exposes the inability, particularly of European governments, to think longer term and to secure, for instance, rare earths longer term. It also shows certain limits of democracies to plan ahead. Like the Chinese, they wrote in their past 5-year plan that they will utilize their economic power to, and I don't have the exact wording, but to impose their strategic interests in the world. So this is not a surprise that China would do this. Yeah. And yet it catches the Europeans by surprise. So yes, he wants to de-risk, but he doesn't really have anywhere to go with China dominating this market. And we saw the whole question on CO2 neutral engines, that being postponed, that allows them to still continue with their old model of marketing, but it's not working in China. The Chinese market simply doesn't get excited about German cars anymore, and particularly the e-cars, and that may postpone them hitting a wall in terms of sales, but they will always be rescued.
And why hasn't this become a bigger political issue yet? Because you've got Volkswagen, for instance, saying recently that it could completely develop an EV in China without any input from Germany, that it could export that EV from China to growth markets in Latin America or in the Middle East, and at the same time is cutting jobs in Germany. I mean, why isn't there not question for either of you, why is there not a populist uprising against that?
That will come. Don't worry about it. That's why I'm warning, because we better get ahead of the curve, because the US didn't get ahead of the curve in its China shock and ended up with Trump. We'll end up with something similar if we don't actually address this and go beyond just talking nicely to the Chinese leadership and hoping that they'll buy more Volkswagens.
I think Detroit was made in China, basically. The whole
the fundamental fact is the interests of Volkswagen are no longer the interests of Germany. It's partly a Chinese company. The same with Mercedes. So you need to take with a grain of salt what the leaders of Volkswagen say. Take them along on the planes. Just don't listen to their advice. Rather listen to the advice of mechanical engineering and machine tool makers, which are getting obliterated now, and they're calling for protection.
And
now
the business community is divided, isn't it?
The business community is divided, and it's divided between those who, like Volkswagen, think they don't actually, they believe that they can produce more cheaply for the world and for Europe, also in China. They're moving a lot of their production there, and they think that is part of their future. And between companies that don't think they can or should move all their production to China, and that are committed to the European market and producing here. So, and I think in terms of, I do think the Chancellor means what he says, we won't bail you out. The question is whether he can actually make good on that promise. I think the terms of market dependencies on China, Chinese consumers are taking care of this. They're just not buying the stuff anymore, or Chinese companies are not buying the supplies from German production in China. So I think that will sort itself out.
Michaela and Torsten, thank you so much for this kind of whirlwind ride through Germany's dilemmas over China.
Later.
这些德国专家的焦虑，在如今的2026年看来是多么的讽刺。往回倒10年，故事的版本完全是反过来的。2017年，美国启动对华301调查，报告名字就叫《中国的经济侵略如何威胁美国和世界的技术与知识产权》，指控中国强制技术转让，窃取知识产权。这份报告后来直接成了中美贸易战加征关税的导火索。但这里有个问题值得先弄清楚，这到底是中国冲击，还是全球制造业格局本来就在重新洗牌？事实上，欧洲制造业的困境并不是单一原因造成的。能源价格在俄乌冲突后长期高企，德国工业用电成本一度是中国的3到4倍，这直接削弱了欧洲制造业的成本竞争力。电动车转型本身也在挤压传统燃油车产业链，一辆电动车所需的零部件数量比燃油车少30%左右。这意味着，即便没有中国的价格竞争，欧洲的零部件供应商也要经历一轮结构性收缩。再加上美国对中国加征关税之后，确实出现了视频里说的气球效应，被堵住的产能确实有一部分转向了欧洲市场。这几股力量叠加在一起，才是今天欧洲工厂关闭潮的真实图景，而不是某一个国家单方面造成的结果。但反过来说，中国制造业这些年确实是在用实力说话。电池、光伏、电动车这些领域，中国企业能做到全球领先，靠的不只是产能规模，更是这些年在研发投入、供应链整合、工程师红利上的持续积累。宁德时代、比亚迪这些企业的技术迭代速度放在全球都是数1数2的。这种实力不是靠低价倾销堆出来的，而是实打实的产业升级结果。所以这场博弈的核心其实不是中国抢了谁的饭碗这么简单，而是全球化进入了一个新阶段。过去几十年，发达国家习惯了把高附加值留在本国，把低端制造转移出去的分工模式。而现在，中国正在从世界工厂变成世界工厂加研发中心的双重角色，这打破了原有的分工默契，也自然会带来阵痛。德国现在想靠国防工业转型来接住这波冲击，这个思路视频里说得很清楚。政府订单能稳住工厂和就业，但军工产业毕竟养不起一个国家几十万级别的汽车产业工人，这更像是一种止血，而不是治本。真正的问题从来不是要不要挡住中国产品，而是欧洲能不能拿出自己的产业升级方案，在电池、智能制造、新能源这些赛道上重新找到自己的位置。德国商界现在的分裂，某种程度上也是这种错位心态的真实写照。一部分企业像大众一样，已经在中国建立起完整的研发和生产闭环，甚至打算绕开德国总部，直接向全球市场输出。另一部分传统制造业则还在指望靠贸易保护，把时间拉回到那个技术单向流动的年代。语速机器人那次小小的闭门谢客，说到底是一个缩影，它造出的不是中国有多小心眼，而是西方这些年一直挂在嘴边的那句指责，如今正原封不动地砸回了自己脚下。